They tell me I should not be talking about any of this. The doctors here are polite about it, but the men who pay the doctors are not. Every other day a clerk in a clean gray tunic walks down the corridor with a tablet under his arm, sits beside the bed, and asks me to sign another form that says I will not write down what I am about to write down. I sign. He leaves. The nurse changes the drip in my arm and looks at me the way nurses look at men who are not going home, and I wait until the lights dim and pick up the pen again. My name does not matter much anymore. In the records they kept on us, we were a designation and a pair of numbers, but the men in our company called me Angel because I had been a chaplain's son before the draft, and because I was the one who walked point through doors nobody else wanted to walk through. My partner they called Satan. He was a brick of a man from the southern continent, scarred across the bridge of his nose, with hands that could close around a service rifle and make it look like a child's toy. We had been bonded out of the orphanage program together at 15, trained together at 18, and by the time they sent us up to the Vega Belt, we had been working as a two-man entry team for the better part of a decade. You do not need to know our real names. The names we answered to in the corridors will do. The Vega Belt was a string of rock and ice strung out around a dim orange star, and the only thing that made it worth holding was the habitat at its center. They called the habitat Resnik Station, after the old physicist who had built the first reactor on it, back when the asteroid belt was nothing but a prospecting claim and a few pressurized tin cans. By the time I was assigned there, it had grown into a wheel the size of a small city, 12 kilometers across at the rim, with 30,000 souls living in the spokes and another 10,000 on the smaller rocks within shuttle range. We mined platinum group metals out of the belt and shipped them sunward, and that was supposed to be the whole story of the place. It was not. The first reports came in the spring of my second tour. A surveyor's shuttle had gone missing between two of the outer claims, and when the salvage tug went out to look for it, they found the wreck spinning slow against the dark with all 6 crew aboard and all 6 crew dead. The bodies were not marked. There were no breach holes in the hull. The cabin atmosphere was still warm. But every man and woman on that shuttle had been crushed flat against the deck plates, as if something the size of a freight car had stepped on them from the inside, and the bones in their bodies had been turned to a fine gray slurry that pooled inside their skin like wet sand inside a glove. I did not see the recovery footage. Satan did. He watched it twice, set the tablet down very carefully on the mess table, and said nothing for the rest of the meal. That was the first I knew that something was coming. By midsummer there were 5 more wrecks, then a mining barge, then a pressurized habitat on one of the smaller rocks where 42 men had been sleeping when whatever it was came through the airlock. The station council convened an emergency session and called in every off-duty operator on the wheel, and our captain pulled Satan and me into a briefing room with 6 other pairs and a man none of us had ever seen before. His name was Professor Resnik, not the old Resnik the station was named for. That one had been dead 100 years. This was his great-grandson, a thin gray man with rimless glasses and ink stains on his cuffs, and he had come up from the inner system on a fast courier 2 days before. He did not waste our time. He pulled up a recording on the briefing screen and let us watch it without commentary for almost a full minute. The recording showed an empty mining tunnel, the kind of bored-out corridor the dust crews ran their conveyors through, lit by a single yellow work lamp at the far end. For 30 seconds nothing happened. Then the dust on the floor of the tunnel began to move, not blown by air, not shifted by vibration. It moved the way water moves around a wadding man's ankles, parting and closing and parting again, and the parting traced out a path down the tunnel toward the camera, and the path was the shape of something walking on 2 legs. Whatever it was, the camera could not see it. The dust could. Resnik shut the recording off and told us what he had concluded. The adversary, he said, was not invisible by any trick of camouflage. The adversary was bending the light around itself in a way that no human optical system and no human sensor would register. He had spent 3 weeks running the math, and he was reasonably sure they were a species. He was reasonably sure there was more than one. And he was certain, beyond reasonable doubt, that the weapon they were using on our cruise was not a beam or a projectile but a resonance field, tuned to the calcium lattice of the human skeleton, that could turn a man's bones to powder in the time it took him to draw a breath. He did not raise his voice when he said any of this. He did not have to. The captain asked him what we were supposed to do about it. Resnik took off his glasses and polished them on his cuff and put them back on and said, very quietly, that he did not know. He said the science of the thing was beyond him in any practical sense. He said the only useful piece of information he could offer was that the field they used had a very short range. Inside 3 meters, he said, a human being would be reduced to pulp before he could finish a sentence. Outside 30 meters, the field could not be generated. Between those numbers, the adversary preferred the closer end. They liked to be near. They liked, he said, to watch. We sat in that briefing room for a long time after Resnik left. The other operators talked about countermeasures, about dust filters in the corridors, about pressure-sensitive flooring, about the kinds of motion sensors that might pick up a body the eye could not. Satan did not talk. He sat with his elbows on the table and his big scarred hands folded in front of him, and after a while he looked up at me and said, in his slow southern drawl, that the science boys could play with their dust if they wanted. He said what we needed was hands. He said anything that close, you did not need to see it to grab it. He said you only had to be willing to grab. I remember thinking he was wrong. I remember thinking the man was tired and the man was scared, the way we were all scared, and he was reaching for the only kind of answer his hands knew how to give. I did not say so. We were a pair, and a pair does not argue in front of the others. But I remember thinking it, and I remember being wrong. The first time I saw one was 3 days later. We had been sent down to the lower freight ring on a report of an intruder in the long-term cargo bays. The report came from a maintenance worker named Nando, a small, wiry man with a tool belt and a permanent stoop, who had been doing a routine pressure check when he heard breathing. That was the word he used, breathing. He could not see anything, he said, but he could hear breathing in the corridor with him, and he had backed out very slowly and very quietly and run for the nearest comms panel and called us. Satan took point. I took the wing. Nando came behind us with a hand lamp and a face the color of pressed paper. We moved through the cargo bay one container at a time, sweeping the dust on the floor with low-angle light the way Resnik had told us to, and for 20 minutes we found nothing. Then, just as Satan was turning to call the search off, the dust between 2 of the containers parted. He saw it before I did. He did not call out. He did not raise his rifle. He stepped forward, and he stepped forward fast, and he closed the 3 meters between him and the thing on the floor in the time it took me to register that he was moving. He hit the empty air the way a man hits a heavy bag, both hands open and driving, and the empty air hit back. Something solid and ridged and humming with a low frequency. I felt in my teeth slammed into Satan's chest and lifted him off his feet. And for a sickening instant, I thought I was about to watch my partner die. I did not. The thing tried to bring its weapon to bear on him, and Satan had his hands around what he could not see, and he was pressing in close enough that the resonance field, if the thing tried to fire it, would burst against Satan's own body and kill the carrier as surely as the target. Resnik had not told us this. Resnik had not known. But Satan knew it in the way an old fighter knows the inside of a clinch, and he stayed there, snarling, his arms crushing inward on something the eye refused to admit existed. And after a long 4 seconds, the thing in his hand stopped struggling and began to make a noise like a wet pipe venting steam, and then it went limp, and then it bled out onto the deck. The blood, when it came, was the first part of it we could see. It pooled on the deck plates in a shape that was almost but not quite human, and where it pooled the light bending stopped working, and inch by inch the body that had been invisible faded into view. It was taller than a man by half a meter. Its limbs were too long and there were too many joints in them. Its head was narrow and eyeless, ridged with what I took at first to be scales and later realized were sensor pits, hundreds of them, each one no larger than the head of a pin. Its mouth was a vertical slit that ran from its chin to the top of its skull, and inside the slit there was no tongue but a cluster of fine pale filaments that twitched once after it died and then lay still. Satan stood over it for a long time, breathing hard, his uniform soaked black down the front. Then he looked at me, and his face was the face of a man who has just learned a thing he wishes he had not learned, and he said only this: "They can be killed. They just do not expect us to try." That night Resnik came down to the morgue and stood over the body and did not speak for almost an hour. When he finally did speak, it was not to us. It was to the dead thing on the table. He asked it, very softly, what it had wanted. He did not get an answer. He did not expect one. But I have thought many times since that he was already beginning to suspect what I am about to tell you, and that he did not want to say it out loud because he did not want it to be true. We called them ghosts after that, because we had to call them something, and because no one wanted to give them a name with any dignity in it. Within a week, we had killed 3 more. The second was in a stairwell off the agricultural ring, where a pair from our company named Ramiro and Enrique cornered one against a hydroponics tank and went in close on Satan's example, and both men came out of that stairwell. But Ramiro came out missing the left side of his face, where the ghost had gotten a hand on him before they brought it down. He kept his rifle in his right hand all the way to the infirmary, and he would not let anyone take it from him. The third was in a recreation lounge on one of the spokes, where it had cornered an elderly machinist named Bugarini, who had been a wrestler in his younger years, back on the colonies, and Bugarini had not lasted long, but he had lasted long enough to leave the thing slow and bleeding by the time we arrived. He died on the lounge floor with his hands still curled into fists. The fourth came at us in a supply corridor, and we lost 2 more men taking it down. A kid named Gustavo Nieto out of the southern continent, and a corpsman, whose name I will not put here because his wife is still alive, and I do not want her reading this. Within 2 weeks we had lost 11 men, killing them, because for every one of them we caught at close quarters, there were 2 more behind it that we did not catch, and the resonance field did not need to find you at close quarters. It only needed to find you alone. The corridors of Resnik Station began to empty. Men stopped walking the spokes by themselves. Men slept 4 to a bunk and would not go to the head without a partner at the door. And the mess hall at the rim, which had served 3,000 at a sitting, now ran at half capacity, and the food got cold on the warming trays because no one wanted to leave the table. The civilians were the worst of it. They stopped going to work. They stopped sending their children to the schools on the inner ring. They gathered in the chapels on the spokes, the old chapels, the ones the early colonists had built into the bulkheads when Resnik Station was still a frontier post, and they sat there for hours at a stretch with their hands in their laps, because there was nowhere else on the station that felt safe, and because no ghost had ever yet been reported in a chapel. The chaplains hated it. The chaplains had always wanted full houses, and they had got full houses now, and the price of the full houses had broken them. I went to one of those services in the 3rd week, because Satan wanted to go, and because I was not going to let him go alone, and I sat in the back pew of a small steel chapel on the inner ring while a woman with gray hair read out the names of the dead, and the list took 40 minutes, and when she was done she sat down and did not stand up again for the rest of the service. There was nothing more to say. We all knew the names already. We just needed to hear them, said aloud by someone whose job it was to say them. Satan did not pray. He sat beside me with his big hands folded in his lap and his eyes on the deck plates between his boots, and after a long time he said only that he had counted 17 pairs of empty seats in the front 3 rows, and that every one of those seats had a name on it now, and that he did not know how the chaplains would manage when the seats ran out. I did not have an answer for him. We went back to the barracks together, and we cleaned our weapons, and we did not speak again that night. It was in the third week that the second body turned up. Not a ghost, a human body. A woman, mid-20s, blonde, the daughter of a station counselor named Sanchez Peña. She had been working as a research assistant in Resnik's laboratory, and she had not come home from her shift. They found her in a maintenance crawlspace under the secondary reactor, and she had not been killed by a resonance field. She had been killed by a human hand. Specifically, she had been killed by a length of insulated cable wrapped twice around her throat and pulled tight from behind by someone she knew well enough to turn her back on. The counselor's wife came to identify her. I was there. I do not have the words for what that woman's face looked like when they pulled the sheet back. I do not want them. I will say only that her name was Carmen, the daughter's name, and that she had been engaged to a junior engineer named Antonio, and that within 2 days Antonio was missing as well. And within 4 days, a maintenance worker found him in the same crawlspace with a service pistol in his hand and a hole through the roof of his mouth. And the note in his pocket said only that he was sorry and that he had not known what they were going to do to her. That was when we understood. The ghosts were not the only enemy on Resnik Station. There were men, our own men, who had been working for them or with them or for whoever was behind them. Carmen had found something in Resnik's lab. Antonio had given her up. Whatever she had found had been worth killing her for, and worth killing Antonio for once he became a loose end, and worth turning what was left of Resnik Station into a slaughterhouse, so that no one would look too closely at the work being done in the secondary reactor while the corridors burned. Inspector Saldivar came on with the case the morning after Antonio's body turned up. He was a slow, heavy man from the station police, mid-50s, with a salt-colored mustache and a habit of writing notes in a paper book he carried in his coat pocket instead of trusting them to a tablet. He had been a homicide investigator on one of the inner colonies for 20 years before he came up to Resnik, and he had the patience of a man who has watched a great many people lie to him and lived to read his notes back to them later. He pulled Satan and me into a small office off the morgue, and he laid out what he had. He had Carmen's movements in the last 12 hours of her life. He had the duty roster for the secondary reactor for that week, and he had 3 names on it that did not appear in any other station record, which meant somebody on the inside had cleared those 3 names into the reactor wing without going through the personnel office. He had Antonio's note. He had a list of 17 civilians who had gone missing on the station in the last 60 days, and he had a map of the missing person reports laid over a schematic of the station's ventilation system, and the missing people had all been last seen within 6 meters of an intake. He did not know what that meant yet. He said he was going to find out. He found out 3 days later. He found out by following one of the names on his duty roster into a service corridor at 4 a.m, alone, because Saldivar was the kind of man who did not call for backup when his backup was already dying, and we found him at 6 a.m. in that same service corridor with his paper notebook still in his coat pocket, and his throat opened ear to ear by a length of insulated cable. The cable was the same gauge as the one that had killed Carmen. The notebook had 3 new pages of writing in it that were not in the chain of evidence by the time we read it, because Satan took the notebook out of Saldivar's coat himself before the station police arrived and put it in his own jacket. He did not trust them anymore. He was right not to. 2 of the men on Saldivar's duty roster were station police lieutenants. Satan found the courier first, a man named Gustavo, mid-rank in the station administration, who had been quietly funneling work orders into a sealed wing of the lab that no one was supposed to know existed. We took him alive. We took him alive because the captain ordered it, and because Satan, for all his size and for all the work his hands had done, was a disciplined man and did what his captain told him. We took Gustavo into an interrogation room with the cameras off, and we sat him down across from us, and Satan cracked his knuckles once, and Gustavo started talking before Satan could even ask the first question. There was, he said, another professor on the station, a man named Davenport. He had come up from the inner system on the same courier as Resnik, but he had been on it for different reasons. Davenport had not come up to study the ghosts. Davenport had come up to deal with them. He had been in contact with them, Gustavo said, for the better part of a year, through a relay buoy he had planted on one of the outer claims. He believed they could be reasoned with. He believed they were a civilization, not a plague, and that the killings were the result of a misunderstanding about territorial boundaries that he, with the right credentials and the right gesture of good faith, could resolve. The good faith he was prepared to offer them was the technical specifications of Resnik's resonance shielding work, the only line of research on the station that might one day let humans walk the corridors without being turned to slurry. Carmen had found out. Carmen had told Resnik. And Davenport, or whoever Davenport answered to back home, had paid to have her silenced. I asked Gustavo if he had killed her himself. He said no. He said he had only carried the message. He said it the way a man says it when he has rehearsed the answer in his head for days. Satan looked at him across the table for a long, quiet moment, and then he stood up and walked out of the room without saying a word, and I stayed with Gustavo, and Gustavo wept, and I did not comfort him. We took the file to Resnik that night. The old man read it through twice, and then he took off his glasses and set them on the desk and put his face in his hands. He stayed that way for a long time. When he looked up, his eyes were red, but his voice was steady, and he said only that the work would have to go faster now. He said Davenport would know within the day that Gustavo had been taken. He said the trade, whatever it was, would have to happen soon, and if it happened, we would never see the inside of our own corridors again. He said we had perhaps a week. We did not have a week, we had 4 days. On the 4th day, Davenport sent his message. He sent it through every comm channel on the station at once, a single audio file that overrode the normal feeds and played in every corridor and every cabin and every bunk for 90 seconds. The voice on the file was his, calm and professorial, and the message was simple. He had reached an agreement with what he called the visitors. The agreement was that Resnik Station would be evacuated within 48 hours, that all military personnel and all research personnel would surrender their weapons and their data archives at the rim airlocks for transport to the inner system, and that any human still aboard at the end of the 2nd day would be considered a hostile element and dealt with accordingly. He said he had no doubt that we would all see in time that this was the only path forward. He said the visitors were a magnificent species. He said we had much to learn from them. He said he was sorry it had come to this, and then the file cut out, and the corridors of Resnik Station went very, very quiet. The captain called every operator on the wheel into the rim mess at 400. There were 43 of us left. 8 pairs had been killed in the first 3 weeks. The rest were still on roster, but 4 of those men were in the infirmary and would not be walking out. The captain stood on the warming counter and laid the situation out the way a captain has to lay it out when there is no good answer. He said we could evacuate. He said the inner system would call it a tactical withdrawal, and there would be no court-martials and no notes on our records. He said the alternative was that we stayed, and that we found Davenport, and that we broke whatever channel he was using to talk to the ghosts before he could finish the trade. He said he was not going to order us to choose the second option. He said the men who chose it were going to die in the corridors of this station within the week, and he was not going to lie to us about that, because we were not the kind of men who needed to be lied to. He did not put it to a vote. He did not have to. Satan stood up first, and I stood up with him, and after a moment Nando, the wiry little maintenance worker who had heard the breathing in the cargo bay, stood up too, because Nando was not an operator, but Nando had been with us in every sweep since that first night, and Nando had decided somewhere along the way that he was one of ours. Within a minute, every man in the room was on his feet, and the captain looked at us with an expression I did not have a name for at the time and have not found one for since, and he said only that the briefing would be in 1 hour, and that we should eat before we came. The plan was Resnik's mostly. He had spent the night with charts of the station's power grid and a sheaf of his great-grandfather's old engineering notes, and what he proposed was this. Davenport's relay buoy, the one he had used to talk to the ghosts, was running on a leased data channel that fed through Resnik Station's primary communications array. If we could take the array, we could cut the channel. But the array was on the outer rim, 12 kilometers around the wheel from the secondary reactor where Davenport was holed up, and the corridors between were now patrolled by ghosts who knew the layout as well as we did, and who could walk through them invisible to anything but dust. Resnik did not have a counter to the light bending. He had not had time. What he had was a single working prototype of a resonance dampener, the device Carmen had died for, and it would protect a single man inside a 3-meter radius for as long as its battery held. The battery held for 90 minutes. After that, the dampener was an inert brick. The plan called for 2 teams. One team would carry the dampener through the corridors to the comm array and take it down. The other team would go after Davenport. The first team needed to move fast and quiet, and it needed only the best entry pair we had. The captain looked at Satan when he said this, and Satan nodded once, and that was how the assignment was made. We left at 700. Nando came with us, because Nando knew the maintenance corridors better than anyone on the station, and because Nando had insisted, and the captain had given up trying to talk him out of it. He carried the dampener in a satchel slung across his chest. Satan carried the breaching gear. I carried the long gun and the side arm and a heart that had not been still since the captain stood up on the warming counter. The first kilometer was easy. The maintenance corridors at the rim were narrow and badly lit, and full of the kind of pipe runs that made a man have to turn sideways to get past, and the ghosts did not seem to like them. We saw no movement in the dust. We heard nothing. Nando led us through 3 pressure doors and a long crawl past a coolant manifold and out into a wider service tunnel, and we made good time for the better part of half an hour. The second kilometer was where we lost him. There is no good way to write this part. I have tried in the long nights here to find a way that does not feel like an insult to him, and I have not found one, so I will write it the way it happened. We came around a bend in the service tunnel and the dust on the floor parted, 6 meters ahead of us in the shape of something walking, and Nando saw it first because Nando was looking down and the dampener was in Nando's satchel. He did the right thing. He did the only thing. He stepped forward into the dampener's radius and he kept walking and he put himself between the thing in the corridor and Satan and me. The dampener held. The ghost's weapon did not fire, but the ghost did not need its weapon at 6 meters. It needed only to close the distance, and it closed the distance fast. And Nando was a small, wiry man with a tool belt and a stoop, and he had never been trained to fight anything, and the ghost broke him. It broke him with its hands. It broke him so that we could see, for the first time, what those hands could do when the weapon was not available. It lifted him off the deck by the front of his coveralls, and it drove its other hand into his chest the way a man drives a piling into wet earth. And Nando's chest came open, and Nando's eyes went wide, and Nando died with his mouth still trying to say a word he did not get out. Satan was on the thing before the body hit the floor. He came in low and he came in fast and he took it by what would have been the hips on a human, and he lifted, and he turned, and he slammed the thing down on the deck plates with all his weight on top of it. The dampener spilled out of Nando's satchel and rolled across the floor and came to rest against the wall, and the green light on its housing was still steady, and I scrambled for it and got it in my hands. I did not have to use it. Satan did not give the thing a chance to fire. He had its head in his hands, and he was driving his thumbs into the sensor pits along its skull, and the thing was thrashing under him, and after about 10 seconds the thrashing slowed, and after 15 it stopped. He stood up and he stepped off it. He stood over Nando for a long time without speaking. Then he picked up Nando gently, the way you would pick up a child who had fallen asleep on a long shuttle ride, and he carried Nando to the wall of the corridor and he set him down against it, and he closed Nando's eyes with 2 fingers and he said only this: "We will come back for him." We did not come back for him. I want that on the record. We did not come back for him because we did not come back, because by the time the corridors of Resnik Station were quiet enough to come back to, Nando had been dead for a long time, and what was left of him was not Nando anymore. We went on. Satan took the dampener and I took the long gun, and we covered the next 4 kilometers without speaking. The corridors were getting wider now and brighter, and the dust on the floors was thinner, which meant we could not see the ghosts as well, which meant we had to move slower, and the dampener battery was burning. We had used 12 minutes of it on the first encounter. We had 78 left. We had 8 kilometers still to walk. We made the next 3 of them in 50 minutes. We took a freight elevator up from the service ring to the main concourse on the spoke that ran out to the comm array, and the concourse was empty, because the station residents had been evacuated to the inner habitats, and the corridors had been cleared for the trade. I had never seen Resnik Station empty before. It was worse than I had expected. The lights were still on. The piped music was still playing in the food court at the spoke junction. There were tables set for lunch in one of the cafes with the chairs still pushed back from them, and the napkins still folded, and there was nothing alive in any of it but us. And there had been 40,000 people on this station 2 weeks ago. The ghost in the food court came at us from behind a planter. I saw the dust move and I shouted, and Satan raised the dampener. But the ghost was already too close. 3 meters, 2, 1, and Satan dropped the dampener and met it with his hands the way he had met the one in the cargo bay on that first night. They went down together in a tangle of limbs, and Satan's mouth was bleeding before they hit the floor. I could not fire. I could not see the thing well enough to fire without hitting him. I grabbed the dampener off the deck and I came in close enough that the field covered them both, and I put the muzzle of the long gun against where I thought the thing's head should be, and I fired 3 rounds. The blood came up out of nothing and painted Satan's chest and face. He lay on the floor for a long moment breathing hard, and then he rolled the body off himself and stood up. And he looked at me and he said, "You are getting better at this." He smiled when he said it. I want that on the record too. He smiled. We made the comm array at the 83-minute mark. The dampener had 7 minutes of charge left. The array was a forest of antennae and signal conduits on the outermost ring of the station, in a pressurized dome at the rim, and the dome was empty when we breached the door. Davenport had not bothered to defend it. He had not believed any of us would get this far. We found the right conduit, the one feeding the least data channel, and Satan placed the breaching charge on it himself, and we backed off and we set the timer, and we went out the other side of the dome and into the maintenance corridor on the spinward side, and we were 200 meters down the corridor when the charge went off and the least channel died. We did not hear from the second team for another hour. By the time we did, the ghosts already knew the trade was off. They came for us in the corridors. They came for us the way they had not come for us before, in numbers 4 and 5 at a time, no longer trying to be careful and no longer trying to be subtle. The dampener was dead. We had the long gun and the sidearm in Satan's hands, and that was what we had, and we used them. I do not remember most of what happened in those corridors. I remember running. I remember pressing my back to a wall in a service alcove, and hearing the dust move 6 meters out, and firing blind and hearing something fall. I remember Satan going through a pressure door shoulder first because the controls had been jammed, and I remember the thing on the other side of the door getting both arms around him before he could get his hands up, and I remember stepping into the dampener's range that was no longer there, and putting the muzzle of the long gun against the back of where I thought its skull was, and I remember the gun jamming, and I remember not hesitating, and I remember the knife. The knife is the part I do not like to write about. I will tell you that I used it. I will tell you that close in, with no field between us, the ghost could not bring its weapon to bear without killing itself, and that Satan had been right about that on the first night, and that I worked the knife the way Satan had worked his hands in clothes, and that the thing died in a way I will not describe, and that I will hear in my sleep for the rest of whatever life I have left. I will tell you that when it was done, Satan pulled me to my feet, and looked at me and said only that we needed to keep moving. We kept moving. We took a freight conveyor down 2 decks and we came out onto the main concourse of the inward spoke, and the concourse was where they were waiting for us. Not one ghost. 3 sets of moving dust at the far end of a corridor 100 meters long, and a 4th set behind us between us and the conveyor, cutting off the retreat. Satan saw the rear one first. He turned without speaking and he walked back the way we had come, and I understood after a half-second what he was doing, and I let him do it. He was going to take the rear one himself. He was going to take it himself because we did not have time to fight all 4 at once, and because if we did not clear the rear one we would have nowhere to go when the front 3 closed the distance. He went down the corridor at a run. I do not have the words for what I watched him do. I will say only that he closed the 3 meters, and that the ghost's resonance field discharged into its own body, the way Resnik had said it would if the carrier kept it engaged at point-blank range, and that Satan came back out of the cloud of red mist that resulted with the front of his uniform soaked black for the 3rd time in a month, and his face entirely without expression. We ran. The front 3 came after us. We did not stop running until we reached the next pressure door and got it down behind us, and when it sealed, there were 2 of them still on the other side, hammering at the door with what passed for fists on a thing that had no need of fists, and we did not stay to listen to it. We came out onto a residential corridor in the middle ring, the kind of corridor with apartment doors set every 5 meters and family names stenciled above them in the old colonial script. The doors were all open. The apartments behind them were all empty. The evacuees had taken what they could carry and they had left the rest, and the rest was sitting in the corridors where they had dropped it when they realized they could not carry it. There was a child's stuffed animal on the deck in front of one door, a worn gray rabbit with one ear chewed flat, and I stepped over it without thinking, and then I stepped back and I picked it up, and I put it on the doorstep where the child's parents might find it if they ever came back. They were not going to come back. I knew that when I set it down. I did it anyway. Satan watched me do it and he did not say anything and we kept walking. A pair of ghosts came at us in that residential corridor. They came out of 2 of the open apartment doors at the same time, and we were caught between them in a 6-meter stretch, and there was no cover. Satan took the one on the left. I took the one on the right. I do not remember the fight. I remember being on the floor with my back against a wall and the long gun across my knees and someone else's blood on my hands. And I remember Satan standing over me with one of his own arms hanging at a wrong angle, and I remember asking him if he could still move it. He said he could move it enough. He set the arm against the wall, and he pulled it back into the socket himself with a sound I do not want to write down, and then he picked me up by the front of my uniform, and we kept moving. We reached the secondary reactor at 1500 hours. The second team was already there. They had come up through the lower service decks the long way around, and they had been chewed apart on the way. Of the 6 men who had started the run, 2 were still on their feet. The captain was one of them. The other was a kid named Rahman, 19 years old, who had taken a ghost's hand through the side of his abdomen on the lower decks, and was holding himself together with one arm wrapped tight around his own ribs, and a face the color of wet paper. He was still going. He was still moving. He was still on his feet because the captain was on his feet, and the captain had not told him he could stop, and Rahman was the kind of kid who would not stop until somebody told him he could. Davenport was in the reactor control room. We breached the door together, the 4 of us, and we went in low and fast, and Davenport was alone. He was sitting at the master console with his hands folded in his lap and a small ceramic cup of tea steaming next to his elbow, and he looked up when we came through the door with an expression of mild, almost academic disappointment. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not have a weapon. He looked at the captain and he said, very calmly, that we did not understand what we had just done. He said the visitors had been prepared to leave the inner system alone in exchange for the technical data. He said that without the trade, they had no reason to stop at Resnik Station. He said they would come for our homes now, our wives, our children, and that this would be on our heads, all of it, and that history would not forgive us. The captain did not answer him. The captain walked across the room and put the muzzle of his sidearm against Davenport's forehead and held it there for a long moment without firing. Then he lowered the sidearm and he looked at Davenport with an expression I will also not have a name for, and he said only this: "History will write what it writes. We will not be there to read it." And then he holstered the weapon and he told us to take Davenport into custody, and Satan did, and we did not kill him in that room, although I have wondered since whether the captain made the right call. I think now that he did. I did not think so at the time. We held the reactor for 9 days. The relief fleet from the inner system arrived on the 10th. The 9 days inside the reactor control room are not a story I can tell straight. They blur in my head the way long shifts blur. We had food for 4 days if we were careful. We were careful, and then we were not careful, and on the 7th day we were eating ration paste straight out of the tube and rationing water by the swallow. We held the doors. We held the doors because the ghosts kept coming and the doors were the only thing between them and us, and we held the doors with breaching foam and welded steel, and on one occasion with the body of a station administrator, one of the men had dragged into the room by his collar before we knew he was on Davenport's payroll. The administrator was already dead by then. We used him to brace the inner door against the frame. The captain looked at us when we did it and he said nothing. There was nothing to say. The man had killed 2 of ours in the lower decks. We did not owe him a clean death and we did not give him a clean burial. The clerks in the gray tunics have asked me about that one too. I have not answered them. I will not answer them now. On the 4th day, Resnik came up through the maintenance shaft from the lower decks. We did not expect him. He should have been on the relief shuttle out to the inner habitats with the rest of the research personnel a week before, and he had not been on it. And he had spent the intervening days hiding in his own laboratory with a service pistol. He did not know how to fire, and a tablet full of notes he had been afraid to leave behind. He came into the control room with his rimless glasses cracked across one lens and a cut over his left eye, and he sat down on a folding chair in the corner, and he did not speak for almost an hour. When he did speak, it was to ask the captain whether we had killed Davenport. The captain said we had not. Resnik nodded slowly, and he said he would have liked to be in the room when the question was put. The captain said the question was not yet put. Resnik said he understood, and he did not ask again. He worked in those 9 days on the dampener. He had brought the spare battery up with him in his coat. He had brought the schematics in his head. He sat in the corner of the reactor control room with a soldering iron and a handful of components scavenged from the secondary console, and he built us a second dampener, smaller than the first, with a battery that ran for 2.5 hours instead of 90 minutes. He finished it on the morning of the 8th day. He handed it to Satan himself. Satan took it in his hands and he turned it over twice, and he looked up at Resnik, and he said only that the old man had built it faster than he had any right to, and Resnik said that he had been thinking about it for a long time. I think now that he had been thinking about it since Carmen died. I think the dampener was the only thing he had been able to think about. He sat in the corner of the room and he watched us hold the doors, and he did not speak much, and when he did speak it was to tell us small useful things, the resonance frequency to listen for in the bulkheads, the way the ghosts' light bending broke down in still air, the reason their corpses faded into view after death and not before. He was building a science of the enemy in real time, in a room with the doors welded shut and a dead administrator bracing the frame, and he was doing it well. On the 9th day the ghosts stopped coming. We did not know it at first. We sat in the control room with our weapons across our knees and we waited for the next attempt at the door, and the next attempt did not come, and an hour passed, and then 2, and then 4, and the captain told Satan to take me and Resnik's new dampener and walk the corridor outside the reactor wing and see what we could see. We walked the corridor. The corridor was empty. The dust on the floor was undisturbed. We walked the next corridor over and that one was empty too, and the lights were on, and the piped music was still playing in the food court at the Spoke Junction, and there was nothing alive in any of it but us. We came back to the control room and we reported what we had seen. And the captain stood up from the console for the first time in 3 days, and he walked to the window of the control room, and he looked out at the spoke beyond the reinforced glass for a long time, and he said only that he did not trust it. He was right not to trust it, but it was true. They had gone. The relief fleet came in at mid-morning on the 10th day. 2 cruisers and a hospital ship and a battalion of Marines who had been in cold sleep for the better part of a month, and they came into the docking ring with their guns hot and their boarding teams ready, and they found us in the control room, the 4 of us still alive, me, Satan, Resnik and the captain, and Davenport in the corner under guard, and the dead administrator still bracing the door. The Marines did not understand what they were looking at. They had been briefed for a hostage situation. They had not been briefed for whatever it was they walked into. The captain stood up from his console, and he told the Marine lieutenant that the station was clear, and the Marine lieutenant did not believe him, and they swept the corridors for the next 18 hours before they came back and admitted that the captain had been telling the truth. By then the captain had been dead for 2 of those hours, and Satan had been dead for 1, and Rahman had been dead for almost a day, and the Marines did the count themselves with their helmet cameras running. And there was a record of all of it somewhere in the inner system archive, and the clerks in the gray tunics have spent the last 2 years pretending the record does not exist. Resnik told us later that the species we had been fighting was not a unified force. They were a kind of nomadic operating element, he said, sent ahead of the main body of their civilization the way scouts are sent ahead of a column. Their orders had been to acquire the resonance-shielding research and withdraw. When the trade collapsed and the lease channel went dark, the scouts had no further instructions, and their doctrine, whatever it was, did not include improvising under fire. They withdrew. They went back to wherever they had come from. We have not seen one since. That was not the end of the war. That was the beginning of a different war, a longer one that is still being fought out past the rim of the inner system by men I will not meet. I do not know how that war ends. I know how this part of it ended, and I am writing it down because the men in the gray tunics do not want me to, and because I believe Nando deserves to be in a sentence somewhere that someone might read. Satan did not make it off the station. He took a hit in the last hour of the last day before the relief fleet arrived, and the hit was not from a ghost but from one of Davenport's men. A station administrator we had not known was on Davenport's payroll, who had come down to the reactor with a sidearm under his coat and the last desperate hope that he could kill the man who had collapsed the trade. He killed the captain instead. He killed the captain, and then he killed Rahman, who stepped in front of the captain's body because Rahman had not stopped being the kind of kid who steps in front of things, and then Satan was on him. The administrator put 2 rounds into Satan's chest before Satan reached him, and Satan reached him anyway, and the administrator did not get up. Satan sat down against the console afterward. He sat down very slowly, in the way a tired man sits down at the end of a long shift, and he looked up at me, and he said something to me that I am not going to write down, because it was for me, and because the men in the gray tunics have read enough of what was for me. I will say only that he died with his hand in mine, and that I did not put it down for a long time after. I do not sleep much anymore. The doctors give me something for it, and the something works for about 3 hours, and then I am awake again, and the corridors of Resnik Station are still there behind my eyes. I see Nando against the wall with his eyes closed. I see Rahman holding himself together with one arm. I see Davenport at the console with his cup of tea, and I see the captain not firing, and I see Satan in the cargo bay on that first night with his hands around something the eye refused to admit existed. I see them all. I will see them all until I do not see anything anymore, and I am not afraid of that day, although I am told that I should be. The clerks in the gray tunics tell me that what we did at Resnik Station did not happen the way I remember it. They have written a version of the events that has fewer names in it, and they would like me to sign that version, and I will not. There was a ghost in the cargo bay on the first night, and Satan closed the distance and killed it with his hands. There was a man named Nando who carried a satchel into a corridor. He had no business being in and stepped in front of a thing he could not see, and the thing broke him, and we did not come back for him. There was a kid named Rahman who would not stop walking until someone told him he could, and nobody told him in time. There was a captain who did not fire his sidearm in the reactor control room, and there was a man called Satan who died with his hand in mine and a sentence in his mouth that was for me. These are the things that happened. The clerks can write what they like. I have written this. They thought they could not be touched because we could not see them. That was the mistake. We were never going to win this by looking harder. We were going to win it by walking into the room and putting our hands on what was in there with us, and our hands were going to be enough, because our hands have always been enough, and because we have spent 10,000 years on a small wet rock learning to grip things that do not want to be gripped. The ghosts did not know that. The species behind them does not know that yet. They will in time. There is a long war coming, and I will not see the end of it, but I have seen the beginning, and I have seen what it cost, and I have seen the men who paid for it. I want their names somewhere. I have put them here. The pen is getting heavy now, and the nurse is at the door, and I think I will sleep for a little while. The lights in this room are very steady. There is no dust on the floor. I lie here in the long quiet and I listen, the way Nando listened in the cargo bay on that first night, and I do not hear breathing. Only my own. For now, only my own. They tell me I should not be talking about any of this. The doctors here are polite about it, but the men who pay the doctors are not. Every other day a clerk in a clean gray tunic walks down the corridor with a tablet under his arm, sits beside the bed, and asks me to sign another form that says I will not write down what I am about to write down. I sign. He leaves. The nurse changes the drip in my arm.